Hi everyone, welcome to our very first episode on our channel, Breathe Well, Eat Well, Sleep Well. Today's chairside conversation is very important to me as a teenager, in the age of teens turning into school shooters and mass murderers. I'm sure we want some answers on why kids go on rampage school shootings. Some may say it is the influence of violent video games. Others claim that it is the fascination with violent movies and easy accessibility to guns. Although millions of kids, including me, watch violent movies and play violent video games, only few of them actually go on a shooting rampage. Others say that they are victims of bullying and peer rejection. Although retaliation makes sense, most shooters actually have friends, and their victims were targeted at random. I think a lot of us like a simple answer, and I for one have a simple answer to this. Why? Because a simple answer means a simple solution. And my simple answer is because they are tired, wired, and oxygen deprived. These kids are not sleeping well, and they are not breathing well. They suffer from sleep disorder breathing, or SDB. Researchers believe that sleep disorder breathing, or SDB, could cause neurobehavioral problems by affecting the brain in several ways. By decreasing oxygen levels and increasing CO2 levels in the prefrontal cortex, and by interrupting the restorative process of sleep. They did not only find a link between trouble sleeping and trouble during the day, but they also found a link between early sleep issues and later behavioral problems. Low levels of oxygen cause the brain to stay in a more aroused state, resulting in light sleep rather than deep restorative sleep. This puts the kids on a fight or flight mode, or in a wired mode, instead of rest and digest mode. Sleep is vital for children and has a direct effect on their growth, development, academic performance, concentration, and most importantly, behavior. So what is sleep disorder breathing, or SDB? It is a general term for breathing difficulties that occur during sleep. Its three hallmark symptoms include snoring, mouth breathing, and witness apnea. Dr. Bonuck and her team examined the effects of snoring, mouth breathing, and apnea on behavior from infancy through 7 years in more than 11,000 children. What she found is that by 4 years, children who presented with symptoms of SDB were 20 to 60% more likely to exhibit behavioral difficulties, and by 7 years, they were 40 to 100% more likely to develop behavioral problems. This study shows clearly that SDB symptoms do precede behavioral problems and strongly suggests that SDB symptoms are causing these neurobehavioral problems. This is the strongest evidence to date that snoring, mouth breathing, and apnea can have serious behavioral and social emotional consequences for children. Sleep disorder breathing represents a spectrum of upper airway conditions that can be as mild as snoring or as severe as obstructive sleep apnea. The common denominator, though, for all of this is that breathing is performed only through the mouth. A person who pathologically adapts to breathing through the mouth, resulting from difficulty breathing through the nose, is called a mouth breather. This can occur throughout childhood from infancy to adolescence. Mouth breathing over a number of years could take a toll on the development of the brain. Before we proceed any further, let us have a basic understanding of brain development. We have to understand that brain develops at different speeds, meaning different parts of the brain develops at different rates. There are two parts of the brain of significance that develop at different rates. One part of the brain, the amygdala, which has a role in emotion, aggression, and instinctual, almost reflexive responses. The other part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, regulates mood, impulse control, and promotes sound judgment. Kids' brain is like a sports car with a good accelerator, which is the amygdala, but with a weak brake, which is the prefrontal cortex. For example, if you ask a teen in sober moments whether it's a good idea to get into a car while intoxicated, he or she would most likely say, "No way." That's a relatively immature prefrontal cortex seeing the potentially dire consequences of driving when drunk. But in the heat of the moment, the relatively more developed amygdala screams, "Just do it." The amygdala undergoes dramatic changes at the time of puberty, which traditionally begins between the ages 10 and 12. The brain reaches its full size by puberty. This does not mean that the brain is fully developed and functions similarly to an adult brain. As a matter of fact, the brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex or the PFC, is still changing during the teen years and is fully functioning similar to an adult brain, between 20 to 25. This part of the brain does not fully mature until the mid-20s. If young teens are emotionally propelled by the amygdala, yet prefrontal controls are not as good as it is going to get until the mid-20s, that leaves a decade of time during which imbalances between emotional and contemplative thinking can reign. What most determines teen behavior is not so much the late development of PFC, which is responsible for executive functioning, or the early onset of amygdala, which is responsible for emotional behavior. It is the mismatch in the timing of the two developments. As the kids and teens slowly develop their PFC, symptoms of behavioral disorders fade. That is why sometimes some doctors would say they would outgrow them eventually. Not when the blood and oxygen is hijacked by the amygdala and deprive the prefrontal cortex during sleep due to oxidative stress. What that means is that when amygdala is full of blood and oxygen, there is less in the prefrontal cortex. Our thinking power is discombobulated. We are thinking, but with less capacity and brain power. It's like a car running on fumes. When does the amygdala hijacking happen during sleep? During sleep, the upper airway muscle tone decreases. The negative air pressure collapses the pharyngeal airway. As the tongue and the soft palate relaxes at the back of the throat, or what we can term as pharyngeal collapse, it closes off breathing that might lead to partial airway obstruction, producing an abnormally slow or shallow breathing, or what we can call hypopnea. Or airway closes totally, resulting in apnea or temporary stoppage in breathing. This is like sleeping while someone is choking you. There's no stronger stress signal to the brain than low blood oxygen. I'm not talking about I cannot find my phone stress, but more like I'm afraid I might croak or choke to death kind of stress. It presents a moment of danger or threat to the body. This means quite literally that death is imminent and all hell breaks loose. The body shuts off oxygen from everywhere, including the PFC, and rushes oxygen and blood to the amygdala, and places the body on a fight or flight mode. It does its job exceedingly well by focusing on what your body needs to do right now, at that very moment. This sends a wake-up or arousal message to the brain, so you can reopen the airway. Sleep arousal is often accompanied by loud snorts or gasps. As breathing resumes and oxygen is restored. Arousal from sleep is a protective reflex mechanism that restores airway patency through dilator muscle activation. Though arousals reverse the airway obstruction, they result in the untoward consequences of interrupted sleep, reduced sleep time, and causing increased sympathetic nervous system activation. This is called the amygdala hijack, a term coined in Daniel Goleman's emotional intelligence book. The amygdala is the emotional part of the brain, which regulates the fight or flight response. When the amygdala is turned on due to oxidative stress, it puts the body on a panic mode because of perceived danger or threat, making the brain swell and throwing the throat muscles, tongue, and soft palate into overdrive to tighten the muscles and open the airway, terminating the apneic and hypopneic events, while depriving the others, particularly the PFC, of blood and oxygen. This cycle repeats itself dozens or hundreds of times in the night, wreaking havoc on the body. This puts you on a survival mode every night. It is evident that SDB impacts cognition and some aspects of behavior. It is attributed to the effects of hypoxia, which causes actual physiologic damage to sensitive parts of the brain, particularly the PFC. Through the use of imaging, actual tissue damage to the brain have been identified as a consequence of oxygen deprivation or hypoxia. The importance of executive dysfunction and the involvement of the prefrontal cortex in SDB have been reviewed, and they found out that the most plausible mechanisms of behavioral and cognitive deficits in children with SDB include intermittent hypoxia, making them oxygen deprived, and sleep fragmentation, making them tired and wired. The cognitive and behavioral outcomes of SDB can be attributed to general sleepiness from sleep fragmentation and intermittent hypoxia, the two main components of SDB, which likely impact the prefrontal cortex and makes the kids tired, wired, and oxygen deprived. In a recent pediatric study, children with daytime sleepiness were significantly more likely to have hyperactivity, inattention, and conduct problems, as well as worse measures of processing speed and working memory. In addition, O'Brien and company have shown that aggressive elementary school children were more likely to have daytime sleepiness than their peers. The defining symptom of sleep disorder breathing is excessive daytime sleepiness. The symptom is likely influenced by sleep fragmentation tied to recurrent arousals that occur in response to breathing pauses or oxygen deprivation. Excessive daytime sleepiness is manifested in kids by attention shifting or difficulty staying focused and excessive movement, activity, or hyperactivity. Kids presenting with these symptoms are often misdiagnosed with ADHD. Attention shifting and hyperactivity are the kids' attempt to keep themselves awake and alert. A study revealed that mouth breathing is a significant predictor for suspecting OSA with a positive predict value of 100% and warrants early sleep study tests. A poorly functioning and poorly structured anatomical airway leads to mouth breathing, snoring, and sleep apnea. It can interfere with restorative sleep and ultimately damage the prefrontal cortex, which controls the executive function skills, attentiveness, anxiety, and depression. The prefrontal cortex is the CEO of the brain. It functions to differentiate among conflicting thoughts, like play Fortnite or finish my homework. It determines good and bad, like eat greasy food or salad. It regards future consequences of current activities. It helps predict outcomes. It helps suppresses urges that, if not suppressed, could lead to socially unacceptable outcomes. In short, the PFC contributes greatly to personality development. Again, to reiterate, when blood and oxygen is repeatedly hijacked by the amygdala due to oxidative stress, this will keep the blood and oxygen from the PFC and continue to deprive the PFC of it. Without oxygen, the PFC just stops to function. This can lead to damage to the PFC and could lead to executive dysfunction. This keeps you in a state of high excitement or anxiety and lack the function of calming yourself down. You lack a great regard of future consequences of your actions. You develop poor memory or brain fog. You lack emotional ability to suppress urges that could lead to socially unacceptable outcomes. More importantly, you lack inhibitory control to pause and think before you act. Is it really as simple as the school shooters are just tired, wired, and oxygen deprived? What most healthcare providers often fail to recognize, or what I call their blind spot, is that sleep and breathing disturbances are malignant and have a grave health and behavioral consequences. We could safely say that the cognitive effects of untreated SVB might be far more damaging in children than in adults because they occur during critical periods of development. The researchers hypothesized that the prefrontal cortex helps exert control over primitive reactions to environmental provocation. In other words, when something makes us emotional, neurons in our prefrontal cortex fire, and this helps to stop us from reacting in a violent or aggressive manner. The PFC is crucial for the regulation of anger and other negative emotions. It also allows us to think about the long-term consequences of our actions and to run things through in our minds. So this is another way that it might help the control of our aggressions and impulsive reactions. If we can foresee the negative consequences of an action, for example, being violent towards someone, we might not act that way but restrain ourselves instead. In general, once the PFC is damaged from oxygen deprivation through sleep disorder breathing, the ability to evaluate the future consequences of present actions is impaired. Apathy, lack of motivation, indifference, poor attention, depression are all consequences of damage or injury to the PFC. We can safely say that a person's will to live is directly related to the functions of the PFC. Additional findings were reported in studies that suggested that in the presence of SVB, it can be expected that executive function will be impaired. Permanent impairment of executive function is possible due to sleep disturbance during critical development years. It is clear that the PFC has a huge effect on behavior of adolescent kids. Once damaged, it can totally change a person's entire personality from wholesome to hellsome. Anything that minimizes the blood and oxygen to the PFC can lead to horrible consequences. It can make someone violent, aggressive, and impulsive with lack of remorse and empathy. This entirely transforms somebody as a person. According to Raymond Dolan of Institute of Neurology in London, patients with this type of brain damage to the prefrontal cortex have problems processing feelings of empathy, shame, compassion, and guilt, and resemble a psychopathic individual who is characterized by high levels of aggression and antisocial behavior performed without guilt or empathy for their victims. Their brains function at a diminished capacity for acquiring moral knowledge and social emotions. Kids with damage to this part of the brain due to oxidative stress often know what they are supposed to do, but are manipulated by the reactive part of the brain, which is the amygdala. This means that the kids are more uninhibited and impulsive because their ability to imagine the future consequence of their actions is impaired. Irrational and overly emotional reactions reign over rational and reflective thinking. To sum up all of these studies, we can safely say executive dysfunction appears to be the most prominent area of cognitive impairment in untreated sleep disorder breathing. What clues can we find among these tired, wired, and oxygen-deprived kids? What is the typical facial type of these kids with sleep disorder breathing, or who habitually breathe through their mouth? Mouth breathing has been found to be a cause of abnormal facial development such as adenoid facies or long face and dental malocclusion. In a study of 47 children between the ages of 6 to 15 years, they found a significant predominance of vertical growth patterns among mouth breathers compared to nasal breathers. Mouth breathers demonstrated considerable backward and downward rotation of the mandible compared to the nasal breathers group. Children whose mouth breathing is untreated may develop long, narrow faces, narrow mouths, high palatal vaults, dental malocclusion, gummy smiles, and many other unattractive facial features. The combination of a long face, reduced nose prominence and width, and a retrognathic mandible may be diagnostic facial features of SDB that may warrant a referral to specialists for the evaluation of other clinical symptoms of SDB. It is certain how important the PFC is to the brain, and the research that has been carried out shows that we should not abuse the PFC, like using alcohol, drugs, and even being sleep deprived, as it is very significant to enable us to behave in a responsible manner. Sleep disorder breathing is associated with neurobehavioral morbidity in children. Early life SDB symptoms had strong, persistent statistical effects on subsequent behavior in childhood. Significant periods of oxygen deprivation to the brain can result in permanent damage. These findings and statistics suggest that SDB symptoms may require attention as early as the first year of life. These kids are breathing, but they are not living. They are awake, but not full of life. Sleep-deprived children are more likely to be depressed, lack control of their emotions, and act aggressively. If a gun is put in the control of a tired, wired, and oxygen-deprived teen, and it is pointed at a human target, it will very likely go off. This explanation is not meant to absolve criminal behavior or make horror any less unconscionable, but to increase awareness for the healthcare professionals and the public about sleep disorder breathing. Thank you for watching.